Thank you for tuning into Firebase Prime, your source for tips, tricks, and tutorials to make your life in the Fallout 76 wasteland just a little easier. Tune in every Wednesday as we explore new topics, and starting this Saturday, join me for Blast Zone Briefs, where I'll be doing a deep dive into a new Blast Zone each week. Of course, the easiest way to stay updated is to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell, so you'll be notified about new videos as they're posted. In today's video, we're going to talk about one of Fallout 76's most sought after crafting materials, flux. Once you get into the higher levels, chances are that you'll frequently need different types of this material to craft a variety of different things, whether it be modding power armor, crafting serums, modding weapons with prime receivers, or crafting ammo to use with said receivers. By the end of this video, I hope to provide you with a solid handle on how to harvest and stabilize flux, as well as how to strategically select blast zones to get different types of flux. I'll also show you a surprisingly useful blast zone discovered while doing research for this video. If you already have a solid grasp on harvesting and stabilizing flux, and you want to skip ahead to the section about blast zones, I'll provide the time code to jump ahead to at the bottom of the video. But without further delay, let's get into it. When we talk about flux, it's important to keep two things in mind. First, there are actually 5 different variants of flux, those being fluorescent, crimson, yellowcake, violet, and cobalt. Each variant exists as a unique crafting material and is used for a variety of different purposes. The second thing to keep in mind is that when referring to flux as a crafting material, we're specifically referring to it in stabilized, non-perishable form, which is not the form that you'll initially find it in. Instead, you'll harvest flux in its raw state from one of 2 places, that being either an active nuclear blast zone, or, for a short period, the remnants of a blast zone that's just expired. When venturing into one of these zones, you'll find that nearly all of the area's flora has been transformed into new, glowing, irradiated versions. These are where you'll find your raw flux. While you normally receive 1 piece of raw flux per picked flora, I would highly recommend enabling the Green Thumb perk card if available, as it will double the amount of raw flux received. In terms of the specific variant of raw flux received from Nuke's flora, that depends entirely on what flora you're harvesting. For example, harvesting an irradiated mutated fern would provide you with raw violet flux, while harvesting a blackberry will provide you with yellowcake. Different flora provide different flux. If you're wondering how much raw flux to harvest from a blast zone, the simple answer is as much as you can get your hands on. I'd recommend wearing power armor with calibrated legs, as each piece of raw flux weighs in at 0.2 pounds. You'll ultimately use the raw flux that you harvest to craft stabilized flux at a chemistry workstation, and you'll need 10 pieces of raw flux, all being of the same variant, as well as 3 other crafting materials to create a single piece of stabilized flux. In addition to raw flux, you'll need a glowing mass, a hardened mass, and a single dose of high radiation fluids. You'll acquire these materials by looting the bodies of enemies that you encounter inside a blast zone. Upon death, there is a chance that each enemy will drop 1 of the 3 items mentioned above, but that's not a guarantee, and some enemies, such as Scorch Beasts, will never drop any of the items. Once the blast zone lifts, enemies will no longer drop any of the required additional materials, so I recommend initially prioritizing finding enemies over collecting flux, as you'll have a short period after the zone lifts to harvest any additional flux that you might have missed. Once you've successfully harvested all of your flux and collected the 3 other materials, you'll need to visit a chemistry workstation to convert these materials into pieces of stabilized flux. Once at a chemistry workstation, use the craft hotkey to enter the workstation crafting mode, go down to the Nuked Flora category, and here you'll be able to craft any stable variant of flux that you've gathered enough materials for. Before you begin crafting, I would highly recommend temporarily equipping the Super Duper perk to the highest rank available, or have someone on your team share it out. A fully ranked Super Duper card will add a 30% chance of receiving 2 pieces of stable flux instead of 1 every time you craft a piece. While we're on the topic of crafting, you should stabilize your raw flux as quickly as possible, as each piece will immediately begin to decay once harvested, eventually decaying into inert flux, which cannot be used for stabilization. You can quickly check to see if any collected raw flux is about to expire by going into your Pip-Boy, navigating to the Aid Inventory tab, and changing the tab sort order to spoil by pressing the sort hotkey until it reads sort (spoil). If you do end up with some inert flux in your inventory, not to worry, as it's actually not a bad aid item. While you can't stabilize it, consuming inert flux will provide you with 25% water and 5 disease resistance, while only costing you 5 rads. The other 3 items required to create stable flux don't expire and can be used for later runs. Just keep in mind that hardened masses, unlike the other 2 items, are stored as junk and will be dropped on death, so store them in stash if you can. Likewise, you should immediately stash stable flux after crafting it, as it's also stored as junk. The other materials are stored as aid, so they'll be safe as is. If you end up with a surplus of hardened masses, you can either sell them off or scrap them down to ultracite. Now that you've learned how to collect and properly stabilize flux, it's time to suit up and go pick some flowers in an active nuclear blast zone, because why not, right? To do this, you'll of course need an active blast zone to exist in your world, whether created by you or someone else. If you want to have any control over the types of flux available to you within a blast zone, the best option is almost always going to be launching a nuke yourself. This gives you full control over the blast zone's placement on the map and will allow you to choose locations based on the types of flux you want to collect, rather than having to make do with what's already there. But how do you go about strategically choosing a location based on desired flux? We know that different variants of flux can be harvested from specific irradiated flora, but even if you have a decent knowledge of where those different kinds of flora exist, launching off that is still leaving a lot to guesswork, and nuclear keycards are expensive. Thankfully, someone's found a better way. As part of the Mapalachia project, which uses a custom-developed tool to automatically build maps of resources by processing Fallout 76's data files, Reddit user A Heroic Llama has provided several maps that detail exactly where you can find specific variants of raw flux, pending a blast zone of course. Using the All Flux map, which shows every single location of raw flux available, color-coded by flux variant, you can quickly identify clusters of specific types of flux and create blast zones optimized for their harvesting. But unless you have a generous stockpile of masses and high radiation fluids laying around from previous blast zones, flux availability isn't the only factor that you'll need to keep in mind. You'll also need to consider how many enemies exist within a potential blast zone, because when it comes to stabilizing the raw flux you'll be harvesting, you'll need the crafting materials that they drop as well. Keep this in mind and target flux clusters in close proximity to towns and other points of interest. While doing research for this video, we used this map to test out several unconventional targets, which ended up yielding some very surprising results. Many of these will be detailed in upcoming episodes of Blast Zone Briefs, but I'll go over one of the biggest surprises now. In the past, I've always assumed that if you wanted to get a lot of violet flux, your best options for nuclear targets existed in either the Cranberry Bog or the Mire. When studying the flux map from Mapalachia, however, it quickly became apparent that despite 1,200 hours of game time, I had missed another location entirely. As it turns out, the Toxic Valley region is loaded with violet flux. And not only is it loaded, but with the towns of Grafton and Clarksburg, it's also populated. Even better, you can position a blast zone to partially include both towns. The end result is a blast zone rich with raw violet flux and crawling with enemies to retrieve crafting materials from. In terms of where to find the flux, well, it's pretty much everywhere. Most of it will be violet, but depending on the specific position of the blast zone, you can also get a fair amount of yellowcake and cobalt. In one run through with the green thumb perk enabled, I came out with over 130 pieces of raw violet flux alone. In regard to enemies, you'll find a majority of them inside the towns, but a fair amount can also be found on the outskirts, especially around farms and other points of interest. If you position your blast zone far enough west to include all of Grafton's downtown blocks, you'll most likely get some additional bonus waves of enemies from Grafton's events, as both the Grafton Day and Protest March events still triggered despite the town being nuked. Ultimately, this blast zone checks all of the boxes for being an optimal target. The only real downside here is that somehow this piece of metallic garbage still survived. Regardless, I would highly recommend trying it out for yourself, especially if you're looking for Violet. If you decide against launching your own nuke and instead opt to use a blast zone that already exists, chances are that you'll probably be traveling to one of two places, those being either the White Spring Resort or Fisherside Prime. In either case, you're in for some productive farming, as both of these locations have a ton of enemies and contain multiple types of raw flux. If your destination is a zone encompassing the White Spring Resort, you'll find substantial amounts of both raw yellowcake and fluorescent flux, regardless of how the blast zone was positioned around the resort. Depending on how far east the zone extends, you may also be able to find abundant sources of crimson and cobalt. The only thing that you won't find much of here is violet. A few scattered flora around different parts of the resort will drop it, but finding enough to craft even a single piece of stable flux is next to impossible, so I'd recommend focusing your efforts elsewhere. In terms of enemies that you'll encounter at the resort, you're going to either be killing or frantically running from hordes of glowing ghouls. While these can be incredibly frustrating to kill, especially when grouped, you can save yourself a ton of stimpaks and frustration by simply jumping onto one of the several brick fences or single-story buildings and attacking from above. This method is especially useful when luring ghouls out of the golf club. Basically, just run up to one of the doors facing the tennis courts, fire a few shots at the ghouls inside, and retreat across the street to the top of the pool area's fence to comfortably grind some XP and crafting resources. Finally, if you end up getting a bit too close to one of the ghouls and catch a disease, make sure to visit the resort's sulfur fountain and take a drink to cure all diseases. This can be done even while wearing power armor, so it's something that's always available. If instead heading to Fisherside Prime, you'll be in for an abundant supply of both raw violet and raw crimson flux. If the Sundew Grove is also contained within the blast zone, you'll be able to get a lot of fluorescent as well, which can be harvested from the glowing fungus scattered across the forest floor. When it comes to which enemies to expect, the only types you're guaranteed to encounter are high-level Scorched and Scorch Beasts. The rest could literally be anything, so be prepared for any possibility. While you'll find most of the enemies around the Fisher sites themselves or at bordering points of interest, don't overlook the Sundew Grove if it's in the blast zone. Not only will it provide more enemies for crafting materials, but there's also a strong possibility of encountering a legendary. Finally, if Scorched Earth is still going on when you get there, you should definitely check it out. You probably won't get any of the additional crafting materials out of it, as most battles now seem to occur just outside of the blast zone, but successfully killing the Scorch Beast Queen will land you 4 random pieces of stable flux, not to mention improved repair kits, legendary items, and rare plans. Just make sure to immediately store any ordered flux the second that the event ends, as getting killed with that flux still in your inventory will make it cease to exist instead of simply being dropped. That's it for today's video. I hope that I've left you with a solid understanding of flux and how to go about strategically finding it, as well as provided useful tips about some of the most popular nuke zones, plus a potential new one for you to explore. I'll be back next Wednesday with another in-depth video on a new topic. But until then, for the Enclave.